Hello and welcome to the Gold Goats and Guns podcast. It's episode 11. My name is Tom Luongo and we have a lot to talk about. It's Tuesday, December 31st, 2019. It's New Year's Eve. 2019 is in the books, and with this year ending, I want to talk about two events that will shape 2020 in much the same way they shaped 2019. Brexit negotiations and a potential U.S. attack on Iran. So this podcast is brought to you every Tuesday, so subscribe to it on iTunes or Podbean, Spotify, or any of your other favorite podcast platforms. But before we get to that, I want to remind you that you can follow my work over at my blog at tomluongo.me. You can follow me on Twitter at TFL1728. Live streams, they happen on YouTube and DLive every Monday at 8 p.m. and Friday at 8:30 Eastern Standard Time. Warning, I'm a bad boy with a potty mouth and I'm not afraid to use it. You can also support verified publishers like me by downloading and installing the Brave browser, where you can get paid in crypto tokens called BAT for voluntarily being served internet advertising as opposed to feeding the Google beast. Brave protects your online privacy while saving you time and bandwidth by blocking all those data snoopers, etc., that are feeding the growing surveillance state. And lastly, you can also support me on Patreon at patreon.com/goldgoatsandguns, where you can sign up for the private market reports published every Wednesday and Sunday. Or you can sign up for the Gold Goats and Guns investment newsletter designed to wrap up the geopolitical chaos, global macroeconomics, and shifting cultural trends into a portfolio strategy designed to help you make sense of a world going mad. All right, so I told you I wanted to talk about both Brexit and the recent attack in Iraq in the opening. We're going to talk about the Iraq attack first because I think it's more pressing. The stuff about Brexit is a little bit more esoteric and will take most of 2020, if not 2021, to play out. But let's start in Iraq. So what happened over the weekend? So it's Tuesday, New Year's Eve, and on Friday of last week, there was a rocket attack on a U.S. Base outside of Kirkuk, which killed a U.S. contractor, U.S. mercenary, along with injuring some other people. The big question is our response. And we, of course, retaliated over the weekend on Sunday night with a major attack on Popular Mobilization Unit facility near the Al-Bukaimi-Al-Qaim border crossing between Syria and Iraq, over 200 miles away from the base that was actually attacked. Now, the question is, and having been talking to some people about this, what actually happened here? Because it's clear to me that the response from the United States is way over the top relative to what happened. But at the same time, did the IRGC, the Iran Revolutionary Guard, go off the reservation first? It's a good question. Was this outside of the desires or designs of the government in Iraq and the malocracy in Iraq, for lack of a better term, right? Is that what happened here? Because this was an attack that was going to get a response from the United States, and it was going to get a major response from the United States. And therefore, you have to ask the question of why would they do that unless they were trying to provoke this? Now, that's one question. Or is it that there's just honest-to-God factionalization happening within Iran? And if there is, that's not a good sign. But at the same time, I think our response to it indicates all the same things. Because our response was pretty obvious to me that it was not sanctioned by Donald Trump. Even though everybody under him is trying to make it clear, like U.S. Special Envoy to Iran, Brian Hook, said that this is what the president wanted. Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, they all said this is what President Trump wanted. But Trump hasn't piled on here. He hasn't mentioned this in any way. And the way it was reported in the media makes it look like he was not happy with the results. I mean, look, if this was the case, this would not be the first time that Trump gave an order that was then willfully misinterpreted by the people underneath him who are obvious Israeli agents, for lack of a better term. And I consider Mike Pompeo actually an Israeli agent. I have an article on my blog right now effectively calling him that. Would not be the first time that they willfully misinterpreted what Trump said in order to do the maximal response to put him then in a bad situation. This happened, a couple of years ago with the expelling of diplomats in Europe over, I think, the Skripal incident. And Europe collectively recalled like 60 ambassadors. And Fiona Hill and John Bolton went way off the reservation, and I think it was them, went off the reservation and heard Trump say, well, we'll do whatever they did. What he meant was, we'll match what Germany did or what the UK did, not what Europe did. So the American response was way over the top and really pissed off the Russians. And rightly so. It was done on purpose to undermine Trump's relationship with everybody around him and undermine his relationship diplomatically with other world leaders. And it's very clear that I think this is another one of those incidents. And it's a convenient excuse on their part to ratchet up tensions and kill dozens of Iraqis, kill dozens of members of the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, which are, by the way, members of the Iraqi military. And Pompeo is absolutely livid that Iraq will not separate those quote-unquote Shiite militias, which he hates because they're the ones actually actively fighting ISIS, stopping the use of the Kurds as mercenaries on behalf of Israel to achieve chaos and to achieve the destruction of the Syrian state and to achieve the overthrow of the Iranian government. Remember, never forget that that's exactly what Pompeo wants. And he will do whatever he has to do to try and get this done. And I firmly believe also that Trump is would love to fire Pompeo at this point because he's so thoroughly screwed up everything. He screwed up Ukraine. He screwed up Lebanon. He screwed up Iraq. He screwed up with Iran. He screwed up North Korea. Everything that Trump has tried to do foreign policy wise, Pompeo has been an absolute nightmare. And at this point, it's pretty obvious that Trump can't fire him for a variety of reasons, having to do with the impeachment and the depth to which John Bolton and his national security staff have stabbed him in the back on the way out the door. So it's very obvious these people all work for Israel first and the United States second. I do not for a moment believe that Mike Pompeo is interested in doing anything as Secretary of State that doesn't get Israel's blessing first. Fundamentally, he meets with Netanyahu all the time, and then immediately after he meets with Netanyahu, things get escalated. Always and every time. I fundamentally believe that this response was designed to push Trump into a war while the impeachment was happening. Period. Because it plays right into Pelosi's hands, who's slow-walking the impeachment articles, hoping that they can get a greater charge. And and I said it yesterday in my article, what greater charge would there be than dereliction of duty as commander-in-chief to respond to an attack by Iran? Like, are you kidding? That, he can't ignore. Like, shooting down a drone in June was one thing, and Bolton was firmly convinced he was going to get Trump into a war at that point, and Trump said no. The Shiite militias, the PMUs or Iran, escalating from here, killing, a dozen American soldiers, is going to force Trump to respond in a way that is not good. I mean, this just fundamentally is not good. And so I'm incredibly worried about all this. None of this is good. And so that gets back to the original question. Did factions within the IRGC go off the reservation and do something stupid and force an escalation here? Or what? Something doesn't add up. But at the end of the day, guys like Pompeo and Esper and Bibi Netanyahu are opportunists, and they will use this to their advantage to get what they want from a president that they absolutely are angry with, who won't go to war with Iran. I fundamentally believe that Pompeo, the good fundamentalist, the good dispensationalist that he is, he's looking for the rapture. Bibi doesn't want to be pushed out of power in Israel. So any attacks on Iran are used by Netanyahu to show that, one, he still has control over the United States. He still has power and influence there, which makes him the best choice for prime minister. He doesn't want to lose his power. And the more his political position in Israel becomes tenuous, the more dangerous he becomes. In order to try and hold on to power, he's going to do more and more desperate things. And it's the same thing that's happening with the deep state. The more they're outed as traitors to their country, the more they're going to double down to try and hold on to what power they have. The more we say we don't want this policy anymore, the more they're going to try and convince us this is the policy that we need to pursue. And they will kill more and more people in the process. And there's just no other way of analyzing this. And it doesn't help it that Iraq is a powder keg, right? People are angry about their government in Iraq. They're angry at the corruption. The prime minister, Mahdi, is now a caretaker prime minister in the same way that Netanyahu is a caretaker prime minister, in the same way that Saad Hariri is a caretaker prime minister in Lebanon, right? There's all these caretaker prime ministers in this region because of all these governments have been atomized by the chaos that's been sowed by all of these people. And it's blowing back on Israel as badly as it's blowing back on Israel's enemies. And so with the protests in Baghdad, which have been, for the most part, directed at the government corruption and dissatisfaction with both the Sunni and the Shiite leadership. No one can actually stand up, and the president standing between them, acting extra-constitutionally, as Elijah Magnier pointed out at his articles, and a number of his articles over at ejmagnier.com. And I'll put a link in the description of this podcast to that article. I think it's very important to understand the dynamic about what's actually happening with the president in Iraq acting extra-constitutionally to stop a government from being formed, because he has now stopped multiple Shiite parties from nominating prime minister, even though that's clearly the Iraqi constitutional way. It's not his job to get involved in that. It's not his job to stop that. It's just his job to rubber stamp it, and he's not doing it. But the protests, but he's using the protests in Baghdad as a means by which to galvanize people against anybody being nominated. And so that keeps the political situation in Iraq very fluid and very dangerous. And also ripe for agent provocateurs to be in the crowd, attacking the embassy or like the U.S. embassy, which has happened recently, and all of the stuff that's been going on. And the United States is rightfully on edge about this. But at the same time, they're losing their legitimacy for being in the country. The United States is losing its legitimacy for being in Iraq. And there comes a point where they have to realize that once we attack soldiers who are seen domestically as their liberators from ISIS, that's going to radicalize a tremendous swath of the Iraqi population against the United States, which puts the invitation that the United States has to be in Iraq, the military to be in Iraq, in jeopardy. So again, primary effect is to try and intimidate Iran to stop attacking U.S. forces and destabilizing U.S. position in Iraq, right? To stop Iran from undermining the U.S. presence there. That's the primary reason for striking back. That's the primary goal. But the secondary effect is that we're still backing ISIS. It's very clear that the Israeli neocon strategy in the mainstream media is to play up the threat of ISIS returning to undercut Trump's desire to leave the Middle East. This is all part of the narrative, which undermines national security, so that maybe they can even put a treason charge on him for abandoning the troops as a poor commander-in-chief. I mean, they're going to impeach him for whatever they can. If they could impeach him for jaywalking, they would. But they can't. They've already tried jaywalking, and no one's buying it. But, he doesn't retaliate for U.S. soldiers being killed. So you can see the strategy of how they're playing this thing out. It's pretty crazy. And where I see this going is that a large swath of the Iraqi people are going to turn against the United States. We're already seeing renewed attacks on the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. It's already starting. And it's not agent provocateurs. It's real Iraqi people. I've seen reports from it this morning. I've seen what we're talking about here. We're not talking about violent attacks on the embassy. We're talking about them bringing in cold trucks, freezer trucks, with the bodies of the people that we killed, okay? And parading them around. This is bad. This is really bad. This is not like they're not going to sit here and talk about this in dispassionate kind of, geopolitical chessboard terms now. The Iraqi people are now fundamentally angry, and those images are going to propagate like wildfire. Certainly the Shiites in the country understand that the U.S. is backing ISIS's return and backing Israel's play to turn the Kurds into mercenaries against Iran and the Iraqi government and everything else. They understand all of this. We still have a fundamental shift and some fundamental split and racial memory between Muqtada al-Sadr to the Sunnis in the country. We know that there's still fundamental sectarian divisions within the Iraqi populace. Shiite versus Sunni. We understand that. But at the same time, this is the kind of thing that galvanizes everybody. So what's next? What's coming up here? What happens after this? Does it escalate? I don't know. But let's watch for any kind of escalation on the part of the Shiite militias within Iraq. Their best move would be to do nothing. But if there's factionalization within the IRGC forces, if the crazies are now in charge are now acting independently, the more radical portions of the IRGC are acting independently of their chain of command, then we have a problem. because the likelihood of there being a further escalation here is pretty high. And if they do that, that's definitely going to determine what happens next. And all of this is happening at the same time that that Russia, Iran, and China held naval drills in the Gulf of Oman. It's a clear message to the United States that they don't believe the U.S. controls the seas. You can make that argument as to whether that's laughable or not. I know people who think it's absolutely laughable. They also don't believe that the Russians have hypersonic missiles, but even though they're and everybody's like freaking out about them, but hey, what can you do? At the end of the day, you've got to realize that some things are very real. And I think this is just a clear message to everybody that Gazprom is beginning work on the IPI pipeline coming out of the southern Persian Gulf and going along the shore of the Gulf of Oman and the Indian Ocean, and that they will not tolerate any amount of interference in this pipeline. This pipeline is too important politically, economically, to everybody involved. It's important to Pakistan. It's absolutely desperately important to India. And Gazprom building another geostrategically important pipeline. What else is new? It's Tuesday. So there we go. And the United States not being happy about it. Again, it's Tuesday. Oh, look, the sun rose in the east today, and it's going to set in the west, and water's wet. Nothing changes. So, last points about this, to me, is that Trump lost every skirmish he had with Iran in 2019. Every major incident that escalated the tension between Iran and the United States was lost by the United States. That's both a blessing and a curse. In some ways, it's a good thing because it forces the United States to reveal the limits of its behavior. Okay, we don't actually want to go to war, or at least Trump doesn't. And given that situation, having found those things out over the course of 2019, now the question is, do people feel emboldened by this? Do members of the various factions of the IRGC feel so emboldened by this that they could do something really dumb and poke the bear in the wrong way? And I fundamentally believe that people like Pompeo are trying to cost Trump the election, and that this is all deep state blackmail and all continuation of the radical neoconservatives being in charge of foreign policy and not willing to give it up and not willing to accede to reality, which in the reality is that war is over. The United States lost, and it's just a matter of time now. We're just negotiating the terms of settlement. Trump understands this. Pompeo, Bolton, Netanyahu, the rest of them, they don't. And Trump's willing to sue for peace. But this is a ship that doesn't turn around that quickly. Moving on, let's talk about Brexit. So the big question that has been on my mind, in the back of my mind, for months since I first spoke to Mike Shedlock in what was episode 1 of the current iteration of the podcast, where we sat down and we talked about Brexit while we were running up to that Halloween Brexit deadline, and Johnson and Macron were negotiating the new terms of the agreement. And Mike and I fundamentally disagreed as to where things were going. And what was interesting is that during that talk, I told Mike, I said, your analysis is great. I just don't buy it. And fair enough. I mean, we healthily disagreed with each other about everybody's incentives. And I told him then, I said, dude, I'm happy to be wrong about this, right? If you're right, then we're going to get a far better Brexit than we ever would have expected. And so I wrote an article over the weekend when it finally became clear to me. I was responding to a comment on YouTube and it popped into my head. I'm like, oh, that's what's happening. Okay, I see it now. Now, to be honest with you, by October, I had Brexit fatigue. I'm like, I'm going to assume the worst in these people, and that's probably going to get me right, and I don't need to go any farther than that. And Mike was doing really yeoman's work in terms of really sussing out what people are doing. He was much more heavily invested in it, I think, than I was. And fair enough. And his analysis wound up in the end to be better, and, hats off to him. It was a bold call. I have no shame in admitting that, someone outthought me on this one. It is what it is, right? So I remember saying this, it was important at the time to constantly remind people of where the breakpoints were, where they could still betray the British people. But let's go over what happened. And why I've changed my mind about this. It's very simple. When Johnson came out last week and said, look, we're not going to extend the withdrawal agreement. There's a 2-year extension built into the withdrawal agreement for negotiation of the trade deal. And Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator for the EU, said we're going to need all of that and probably more, which is the standard EU line that we're just going to make this as miserable for you as possible. We're not going to let you leave. We're going to force you to backtrack on everything. We're going to get what we want. We're the EU. Seriously, that's been the EU's negotiating ploy from the beginning, and it's had the backing of all of the political elites all over Europe and the United States, with the exception of Donald Trump and Nigel Farage. But I would argue that Farage is not part of the political elite, but he is part of the popular elite. And here's the thing. Emmanuel Macron is a globalist. He's an evil person. He's vile. I don't like him. But at the end of the day, Macron is also not stupid. He realized that the problem in the United Kingdom was that there was no appetite for staying in the EU, and that if they did stay in the EU, and if they did force a Brino, a Brexit in name only, that it would actually serve to continue to undermine the European Union. It would still work to Germany's advantage because all that money would still be flowing in, all of the German mercantilism would still be possible. The euro would still stay stronger than it needed to be because there was all this money flowing in, and they could continue to hollow out the rest of the European economy. It's very obvious that Macron understands that in order to achieve fiscal integration, which the Germans are dead set against, and for the EU to survive and become independent from the United States from a foreign policy perspective, they had to let the Brits go. That at the end of the day, they had to let the Brits go. And at the same time, the British political elite, the royal family, City of London, and the rest, had to come to terms with the fact that the people still have the power in Britain, and that if they betrayed Brexit, they would lose their legitimacy. All of those factors combined forced a realization on Boris Johnson and Emmanuel Macron to cut bait, that they took this thing to its limit. Kind of like the same way that Donald Trump took Iran to the limit on sanctions and everything else. And Iran struck back and said, I dare you to go to war with us. And Trump had to back down. And at a certain level, I think the same things happened here over Brexit. I also think that in 2019, after the repo crisis in September, now that I think about it, it's become very obvious to everybody in City of London that they were going to be on the hook for the bailout of the European banking system if they were members of the EU, and that alone probably was enough to say, okay, and that we can't go any farther than this, and that we had factionalization within the British elite. At the end of the day, there's no way they could have sold bailing out to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars European banks for them to then still subjugate the UK to EU law, even though we're supposedly out of there. I mean, the whole thing was just insane. And Farage was effective enough in explaining all this, not all of it, but enough of it, that it becomes very obvious now that the only way forward for everybody in this situation was to let the Brits go. So they cut a deal, made all these changes, and then after Johnson wins the election with a Margaret Thatcher-like majority, and I invoke Margaret Thatcher on purpose because Margaret Thatcher never wanted to join the EU in the first place, he then puts the screws to the EU and says, look, we're not even going to negotiate. You're going to give us everything we want, or we're just going to leave at the end of 2020, and there's nothing Barnier can say about it. He can play the Swedish national anthem game like they always do. It's like, you come in there and say, as Yanis Varoufakis said for all the time, that, you'd go in there to talk with the European Union and you'd make your case and you'd be very persuasive and you do all this stuff. And then they just kind of look at you like you just sung the Swedish national anthem and then go about talking like you weren't even there. And that was the way they negotiated with the UK, with Greece, and everybody else. They were not interested in anything you had to say. Their minds were already made up as to what their plan was. And they didn't give a crap about you. And they made it abundantly clear they didn't have to give a crap about you because they're not elected technocracy. And Emmanuel Macron said, that's enough. This is going to destroy the EU if we continue to act this way. And the EU is too important. And all of this hinges on Macron's push for Euro federalization, right? The federalization of the Eurozone's financial services and financial fiscal situation into a single issuer of European sovereign debt and the plan to get that done. And my talk with Ira Harris in episode 7 that put a few other cogs in place, and maybe I go, oh, now I start to get it. And what Ira was saying, my talk with him is like, look, Christine Lagarde was put in charge of the ECB in order to have the political pull and the political weight to force a resolution here of the debt crisis. You say, look, we have $3 trillion worth of European sovereign debt on our balance sheet. We can convert them to Eurobonds, okay? They're no longer Italian sovereign debt. Now, are we going to convert them at a haircut? Of course we are. which would then at the same time put pressure on German banks struggling with the fact that they're owed over $850 billion in Target 2 liabilities. I.e. they have $850 billion worth of European sovereign debt on their books, which is not worth 1/3 that, trading at insane negative interest rates. So they're going to have to print tons of euros to get this done. And at the same time, Ira also brought the point of like, look, the ECB is sitting on, thousands of tons of gold. They could issue gold-backed euro bonds and make that all work. And that would be the way to collateralize it and to give that issue a AAA rating and not the rating of the individual economies. It would take the burden off of everybody. Italy would be ecstatic with this. This is kind of what Matteo Salvini has been arguing for from the beginning. He's like, look, we have to have fiscal realignment within the EU or Italy needs to be let free from this. That's been his argument. It's Merkel who said no to it. It's Merkel who intervened in Italian politics to kick Salvini out of government when he made his push to destroy the coalition. Giuseppe Conte was always in Merkel's back pocket, the prime minister of Italy. So Salvini has been very clear. We don't need to leave the euro. We just need to reform it. So that's fair. And Germany doesn't want to reform the euro because Germany gets all the benefits of the current situation. So this is all about bringing Germany down. The Germans are not happy about this. I've talked to multiple members of the German political establishment about this behind the scenes. And they've all been warning me that this is what France has been pushing for. It's what the UK has been pushing for as well. And I'm like, well, you guys did steal trillions of dollars over the last 2 generations from the rest of Europe and didn't invest a dime back in either your own people or the rest of the continent. So that's the way I feel about it. So I'm like, what a shock. Sorry, guys. But this is what you get for acting like a bunch of friggin' colonizers. It's been my opinion for years now. And I used to get hot water all the time at Newsmax for wanting to describe the German austerity as economic Fourth Reich. It's the truth. It's politically incorrect, but it's true. So what we're going to see in 2020 is the following. Well, let's stop back up for a second. What I was saying to Mike Shedlock originally is I just never thought that they'd put aside their hubris on this. I never thought for a moment that they wouldn't just try and win again later on. I think that we're done here. I think that the movement towards federalization of Europe is going to happen. I'm not saying I'm happy about this, but the UK being out, that's a blueprint for everybody else. It also gives the other member states who are currently struggling a means by which to set better terms for Euro federalization than are currently on offer. So Brexit actually still, even though Macron and Johnson have basically negotiated a way for the EU to cut bait and keep what they have, it's still not a guarantee that it's going to work and that the EU is not going to break up anyway. It's an interesting gambit by Macron. I don't know what's going to work out for him in the end, but it's got a better chance of success than if they had just held on and tried to squeeze the Brits for every last drop of blood. All that would be telling everybody in the EU is we need to get out of this as quickly as possible. These people are insane. So the most likely thing that's going to happen here is we're going to see the financial crisis in Europe accelerate in 2020. Macron will use this to push for Euro federalization, push for Euro bonds. He's going to, by doing this and promising to radically devalue the Euro in the process, that will bring Italy, Portugal, Spain, Greece, and everybody else, and even Ireland onto his side. They're going to get rid of the Russia sanctions because they have to. They have to open back up the European markets. They have to look east. They've got to get this done. That will actually help bring German industrialists on side because they're the ones who have been most harmed by the Russian sanctions. So if you drop the sanctions against Russia, and notice now we have a gas transit contract between Russia and Naftogaz. We've got the beginnings of a settlement in the Donbass. We've got all these things happening with Ukraine. So once that cleared away, and that's probably going to happen the first 6 months of 2020, once that happens, Katie bar the door, bring German industrialists back on side to start investing in Russia again, which they already have started doing. So it's just a matter of getting rid of the sanctions. Now, the problem then is that's going to bring them into direct conflict with the United States, who's dead set against this. And that's a different discussion for a different day. Don't for a moment think that the comeuppance here won't be that the United States will attempt to do even more damage to the European financial system in the process as punishment for this expression of independence, because it will happen. There is no bigger sign in my mind that I'm correct about this now than Michel Barnier, the the chief negotiator for the EU, has been completely and utterly silent for the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks since the British elections. He didn't make a peep about Boris Johnson putting into law there will be no extension. He's not happy about it. I think he might have said something, but it wasn't much. Barnier knows he has no room to negotiate anymore. He's going to have to sue for peace. It's going to be, and you're going to watch Guy Verhofstadt lose his mind. It's going to be great. And anybody who gets off the reservation is going to be slapped down by Macron really quickly. So Brexit's going to happen. Farage wins on both fronts. He gets to get Brexit, a real Brexit. And he doesn't have to take power in the process because, Nigel doesn't actually want to rule. He doesn't want to be in politics anymore. I think he really likes being a radio host. I think he really likes doing his radio show. The City of London and the Royals get to stay in charge and realign themselves with the U.S. They get to stabilize the faith of the British people in their governmental system. The EU is going to go through a debt crisis. And it's never going to get any bigger. And as a matter of fact, you're going to watch Eastern Europe, the non-Euro members of the European Union, the Visegrad Four and the rest of them, I think we're actually still going to see them break away at some point. Because the political union then becomes the big problem. At that point, I think becomes an untenable mess as well. The European Union is destined for the graveyard of history. It's going to get squeezed out in the middle between the great powers to the east and the west of it. And Germany's insistence on austerity and primacy, their primacy as the primal power within the European collective, sealed its own doom. All right, this has been the Gold Goats and Guns podcast for New Year's Eve 2019. I hope you enjoyed the show today. And if you do, please give it a like, give it a review on the various podcast platforms you listen to it on, or leave a comment, or whatever you have to do. But any of those things would be great. We'll talk again. I'm probably going to do another one of these on Friday. I'm hoping to. And it'll probably be more culturally charged as opposed to the political stuff. But that being said, I think I'm going to go. So you guys take care. You have a great afternoon. Enjoy your New Year's. Drive safely, drink responsibly, or not. I don't care what you do. At the end of the day, just be well and wake up tomorrow morning ready to attack 2020 with a modicum of humility. Be well. Keep your stick on the ice.